Postcards from a Dying World, the podcast. For more than a decade, I've reviewed over 1,000 books that are mostly science fiction, horror, and bizarro. This feed will feature bonus audio I have produced over the years, as well as a monthly digest of reviews based on what I've read each month, plus the occasional bonus material about my own fiction. Thanks for listening.
Hello and welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. I'm really excited about this episode. I'm going to introduce you to an author who I'm very familiar with, but it was my first time reading one of his works. And I want to introduce you to JP, who is I have interviewed before or been online with before. So I highly recommend that you check out JP's appearance on the Dickheads podcast with Counterclock World, which is one of PKD's most bonkers books. So you can get a lot of PKD nerding out there. But JP, welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Tell the folks that are not as challenged at pronouncing names your full name and where you're from.
Sure. Hi, David. I'm Jayaprakash Satyamurthy, and everyone in my family calls me JP, so that's absolutely fine, including my parents who actually gave me this name.
Right.
Seems a roundabout way to just get to call me JP.
Well, it's a wonderful name because nobody else has it in the writing world, which
and it's often the longest in any given POC.
right. And so well, let's talk about because you're a weird fiction writer who writes mostly, from what I can gather, like dark fiction and like very Lovecraftian influence, but you have lots of influences that we can talk about. But where did you grow up and how did you get into genre fiction?
Sure. So I currently live in Bangalore in South India. Most of my childhood was spent in another southern town called Hyderabad. And then around the time I was of high school age, my family moved to Bangalore, where I've lived ever since. So I was a precocious reader. I kind of started reading fluently when I was 3 or 4. And by the time I was 5, the preschool I was in, the principal's daughter, for some reason decided that I was so good at reading, they should give me a grown-up book to read. And they gave me, she basically gave my parents The Fellowship of the Ring by Tolkien, which
I probably that's a great place to start, right?
Yeah, it probably took me forever to read it at that age, maybe a year. And I was reading other things along with, like comics and more age-appropriate books and things. But yeah, I think that sort of began.
Was this in translation, or were you already reading?
No, it was in English. Yeah. I've been Anglophone from a very, very young age. Around the time I was a year and a half, for some reason, my parents had only taught me Tamil, which is my language, but they spoke to each other in English, and I became very suspicious and jealous and demanded to learn this other language. And
right.
Because they just had so many more books in English to read and things. I wound up learning way more English than Tamil. So yeah, I was reading it in English. I think very early on, I discovered Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, and I was fascinated by stories like The Fall of the House of Usher. My father had a lot of horror paperbacks growing up, things from the 70s, like the Pan books of horror from the UK. If you've encountered those books.
Keep going.
Yeah. Pan books of horror, various other, horror paperback anthologies from the 70s. And of course, he was a huge Stephen King fan. So I was already reading Stephen King before I was 13. But even though I'd read a couple of stories by Lovecraft and Ramsey Campbell in anthologies, it wasn't really until I was in my late teens, towards the end of my college life, that I really came to sort of fall under the spell of that kind of thing. I went through the usual phase of being a very sort of isolated, withdrawn, uh, you know, a kind of person who found a lot of comfort in Lovecraft. And then I picked up a few good anthologies like The Dark Descent by David G. Hartwell, which are amazing because it just grounds you in sort of the mid to later 20th century horror genre. And that's also when I sort of focused on the fact that there was this one guy whose stories in anthologies I would always find unsatisfying, but then they'd stay in my mind. And it turned out that that was Ramsey Campbell. So, that thing where the ending is not that's kind of fascinating and haunting. Yeah. That's what drove increased fascination with weird fiction.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah,
it
that's
doesn't
interesting.
all line up, you know.
Yeah.
I think Caitlin Kiernan famously says that she doesn't do plots at all, And when I saw the quote where she says that, I kind of got it. It excited me so much.
Right. Well, and it's interesting the idea that I'm not necessarily into this author, but I keep thinking about them, and I keep, and that's, for me growing up, like when I was like 12 or 13, it was, I was already into movies and stuff, and I had read Asimov when I was really young because I started off with science fiction, and the discovery of horror, like, really, I think for me, the mechanics of figuring out, for me it was, and I've said this many times on the podcast, it was the mechanics of figuring out how Stephen King wrote The Raft that was like a light bulb moment for me. And so was it hearing Caitlin McTiernan say the plot thing, or was there a particular story that was just like a light bulb moment for you that were like, this is how it's being constructed and this is what I want to do?
Oh, wow. Just a quick digression. I was also a huge childhood science fiction fan, and Asimov, Clarke, Bradbury, Ursula Le Guin, these are all writers I was gobbling up, in my middle school and high school years. But how did horror sort of come together for me? What was the thing?
Well, like
So,
just storytelling, not necessarily horror, but just story.
so something really important for me was Lafcadio Hearn, who's an American. It's a pseudonym of an American author who lived in Japan and studied Japanese for the greater part of his life. And he had a book of Oriental ghost stories. And suddenly reading them, and one thing was the structure. It's almost oral, and sometimes there's a story within a story. And then also some of the stories, because he's taken them from traditional Japanese ghost stories and traditional, in the case of Oriental ghost stories, and he also takes some from China. I realized that these are kind of stories I've heard being told in my city by older people or by kids who'd heard it from their grandparents and stuff. And that really clicked to me that, horror is very close to home. We have a way of passing along scary stories and treasuring them. They're like coins that are handed down and handed down through the ages. And I, I became very fascinated by the way horror is about things that keep bubbling up and don't remain buried.
Well, and we'll talk a lot more about that when we get into the individual stories that are here. And I obviously, I think geography is an important part of horror, whether you're Joe R. Lansdale writing about East Texas, or Stephen King writing about Maine, or Poppy Bright writing about New Orleans. I think the geography of these stories definitely play a role in their power. But before we get into that, okay, we're talking about your childhood now. We're talking about your influences and things. How'd you get into metal? And I mean, we could do a whole podcast just talking about how awesome Black Sabbath is, because that's something that you and I
We agree on.
are we both write to Black Sabbath, I believe, and like both Ozzy and Dio eras. But where did metal come into the picture for you? Like, because you also play bass in a band and all that. So where did metal come in?
So music was always big in my parents' house. My parents were children of the 60s and 70s. So there's lots of Beatles, Dylan, uh, the Carpenters, a whole lot of, you know, that kind of stuff. And also my parents like listening to ghazals, which are an Indian Urdu form of very sad, melancholic music that's immensely popular all over the subcontinent. So I had a pretty good, diverse introduction to music, and music was important to my parents. There was always either a turntable or a tape player, and evenings would often be spent with music and relaxing. When I was around 13, MTV came to India. And again, it was like, I didn't quite get these long haired guitar bands. They all had these videos with really jarring lighting and everyone whipping their hair about and screaming. And I just didn't get it. It all sounded the same to me. And again, I think it was that dissonance and discomfort that started making me listen to it. And then, of course, a couple of albums, dropped, which became immensely popular among teenagers of my age. I think uh, Iron Maiden's uh, Somewhere in Time was a huge hit. And then suddenly thrash was happening because of Metallica and Ride the Lightning, which came out earlier, but sort of made its way to me then. Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets, Slayer suddenly was because I already liked a bit of horror fiction. I was reading all my dad's Stephen King paperbacks and all these old pan books of horror that he had. And I heard South of Heaven by Slayer, and I thought this is the same experience.
Oh,
At,
absolutely. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I think metal spoke to me early. And like, it's weird because I had punk introduced to me almost at the exact same time. And I kind of got more into punk, but I always liked metal music more. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that, uh, the imagery and and the horror of it all. And I mean, hell, like, Anthrax was pretty much doing Stephen King book reports and like a lot of their songs. So,
yeah.
yeah, it was one of those things. But, and it's interesting for me too, because, in a lot of ways, the music becomes like this, international language where like, I could put on a Bad Brains record, right? And somebody in, you know, that Poland is rocking the same record and they get it. And one of the things that was really eye-opening for me is when I started seeing some of the friends that I had in hardcore bands like touring internationally. And like I didn't understand that like Earth Crisis were guys that lived down the street from me in Syracuse, but um it was a whole other thing seeing them play shows in Colombia and watching videos of them playing shows in Indonesia and say what, like, oh well, yeah, those kids get it too, um, there. And it was really eye-opening for me. And I know that sounds kind of stupid, but the literature I has always made sense to me, but it was just really cool seeing like the music disseminate, because to me it, like, a lot of these hardcore bands felt like geographical or like tied to the towns I was seeing them come from, right?
Yeah.
So, and then it's cool because then you start seeing bands pop up from like Nueva Etica. It's a vegan straight edge band from Argentina, right? And they're fucking great, right? And that's kind of cool. So you guys like play the metal that you play is very, very, very heavy, very kind of stoner metal-y kind of thing. But I've always heard, like, a lot of the bands that I've heard from India I've heard a lot of death metal coming out of India.
Yes.
Yeah, you guys
Yeah.
love your death metal in India too. So it's funny just because, like, here in the States we have like certain regions have their own, like Florida is very death metal heavy, for example. And it was just one of those things that I had always heard that India produced a lot of death metal. And so it's funny because when I first heard your band, I was expecting, and your band is Miskatonic, Gin and Miskatonic, right? And I just expected it was going to be death metal. I don't know for whatever reason, but it's very heavy stuff. And I think people who like sleep and like that kind of stuff will really dig it. So what's the history of the band and how did that start?
Um, I played in a lot of bands in my teens and 20s in college, just about everything.
Yeah.
Alternative rock, prog rock, thrash metal, uh, death metal, just whatever band you were in, and what music you and those three other people were excited about, stuff like that. I was out of music for a very long time, and then in the early 2000s, I started hanging out with people who were actively listening to music, and sort of got over this incipient old guy phase that, oh, I only listen to the music I liked in my 20s. I started listening to bands that were newer to me. And I started realizing that, this whole Sabbath sound that I love so much and kind of had kind of disappeared from the forefront of metal, maybe in the 90s and thousands, at least in the mainstream stuff that you were hearing, because speed and power was so much the thing. Uh, and then of course the whole groove metal thing, which was its whole different scene. But I started finding there were so many bands who were actually going back into that mid-tempo, grinding, spooky heaviness. Uh, and there's this thing called doom metal. Uh, so I started getting excited about playing again. Made friends with people who were starting bands. Played for a couple of years, for a year and a half, for a friend's doom metal band, um, who you may have also heard from Bangalore, called Baversi. And but I wanted to play something a little, I don't know, just a little different from what Baversi did. Maybe they're more groovy, they're more caius, and I don't know. Their sound has also changed over the last three albums they released, but I wanted to do something that could go really, really slow, like grindingly slow at times, and could also sort of culminate with really fast parts here and there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
So
great. It's really great stuff. And of course, the name is a horror reference. Uh, which of course, my listeners should really appreciate. But it's really good stuff. Like how can people track down the music and then we'll move on to your writing.
oh yeah, we're on Bandcamp, where you can hear sample songs and buy downloads if you want. But I think both our albums are up for free on YouTube. So, absolutely feel free to go there and listen to Gin and Miskatonic. That's DJINNANDMISKATONIC, Gin and Miskatonic. And yeah, feel free to listen free on YouTube. Or I think we're on most streaming platforms. There's also a split we did with Sky Shadow Obelisk, a fantastic doom band from Providence, Rhode Island. And you can find that on the Sky Shadow Obelisk Bandcamp.
Oh, that's really fitting.
I believe,
A band from Providence with you
yeah,
guys. Very fitting.
that was super cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he did a vinyl release of it too, which I think is still available. And I was quite excited because, do you know Tad Doyle?
Mm-hmm.
He did the mastering for that split.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, he made it sound amazing.
Yeah, it's really, 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 really good stuff. And for those of us who like, when I actually listened to it quite a bit when I was reading your book, just because I thought that would be a cool combo. Because I like to listen to music when I read. So, and doom metal is one of my favorite things to listen to when I'm reading, anyways. So I listen to a lot of My Dying Bride and I just go to people who like this, and I do a lot of doom metal I don't even know, because I just I find
Yeah.
it so I definitely did that when listening to your book. And then the good thing is that when you made a reference to Massive Attack in one of the stories into a particular song, I was able to immediately, because I listened, I put it on and I was like, oh, that's kind of a neat moment for me.
Yeah.
But yeah, so you started taking writing seriously. I believe you said believe you said before that it was you started writing in college, or were you writing earlier than that? Were you experimenting with this? Just because I know a lot of us who grew up reading seriously, like you can't help but want to tell your own stories when you're like so
Mm,
into these stories as a young person.
I folks tried writing. I would write great beginnings and then not know what to do. I think I only, in my last couple of years of college, started writing stories in my notebook. In the beginning, really basic, simple ideas, you know, like a half-baked Philip K. Dick or, you know, schlock horror ripoff. But at least tell the story from beginning to end. Uh, put something down on paper that at least was complete in itself, even if it wasn't very good. Uh, but I really, and then I did a lot of experimental writing for many years, stream of conscious, concrete poetry, just a whole lot of just trying out things, very influenced by William Burroughs and guys like that. And it was only really around my mid 20s uh, that I tried starting to write genre fiction. For a long time, I struggled to write science fiction, but it was never convincing to me.
Hmm.
And then I kind of had this breakthrough that I think I think I've heard a lot of people telling me a lot of weird stories about things happening in Bangalore, you know, over the years, like maybe hanging out with stoners and people just try to scare each other with creepy tales they'd heard about, oh, this abandoned house in this neighborhood has a talking bat in it. And oh, there's a house outside the city where there's a woman and she's not actually there. And if you come back in the morning, you'll just see a broken down house with a skeleton in it. And you know, all these tall tales that friends would tell me at parties or at, you know, jam sessions and things like that to spook each other out. And I started thinking these would be so great if they were put together into a story. But I found that just retelling, you know, oral legends wasn't interesting enough for me. I started wanting to put in an overarching storyline that I started pulling from my own life, as is probably obvious if you read through the stories and come tomorrow. And I found that it didn't take a lot to just tease out patterns of strangeness and disorientation and sort of take them to logical or illogical conclusions. Yeah, that would be the years when I was 26, 27, 28 that I really sort of caught on fire and started figuring out how I wanted to do this and what I wanted to do.
Right. Now, as far as like what happened for me, I just always enjoyed talking with you about genre fiction and stuff online, and you know, it's one of those weird things of the internet where I you know, we've never been in the same place ever before. This is only the second time we've ever talked. But I feel like I know you really well because you know, we've interacted for literally years online. It's one of those weird things about the internet, and I had always meant to read your work. Like I kept always like making a note, like, "Hey, I gotta read JP's stuff. I gotta read it." And so what happened with Come Tomorrow was that when you came on Dickheads, then it was like that was when I was like, "All right, tomorrow I'm ordering the book and I'm gonna do this and I'm gonna read it." And I had read a couple of your stories here and there, so I knew you were a good writer, and I knew I was excited about it and all that. And one of the interesting things too is that, and I already kind of mentioned this, I love geography in writers and in stories. Like I love, you know, I haven't spent a ton of time in Maine, but I feel like I know Maine a little bit because I've read Stephen King, and then it's kind of one of those weird things where like I have a coworker who's from Maine, and you know we talk all the time about, you know, what Stephen King has taught everyone else about Maine, right? And so when we came to these stories, there's there's the you do such a great job of setting the geography and using Bangalore as kind of a character in these stories, but it's also the problem, you know, the kind of the balance of it is that, you as a writer don't have to write about Bangalore for us. However, because we know how the industry is these days, I'm sure that there's a pressure from some people. Like if you were doing major publishing or whatever, they would be pushing you like, oh, we want to have Indian stories, or we want to have Indian representation, right? And so there's a balancing act that kind of comes with like wanting to write about what you know and the place that you live in without, like, I don't want to seem like a tourist. My point is that I loved getting this view into a part of the world that I don't know, and to the geography, but mostly because it's the geography of this person that I'm becoming friends with is telling me about their life and where they're from and giving me this experience. So I don't know, that's a lot of words, but I just wanted to put out there that that is a tricky balance for you, I'm sure, right?
Yeah. The thing for me is it can only ever be personal.
Yeah.
I'm not writing for Indians. I'm not writing about India. I'm not representing Bangalore. It's what I know, and I'm able to fill a story with texture and with feeling if the setting is kind of vivid to me and part of how I think about things. Uh, I was very influenced by writers like Peter Ackroyd, who's a very eclectic British writer, whose works sometimes veer into the nearly supernatural, like Hawksmoor is a very strange novel by him about a 16th century architect building 7 churches in London after the Great Fire. And the geography of the city and the magical patterns built into it. And then the sense of the city in so many Victorian authors, right? Like the City of London and Dickens. And to take an example sort of closer to the genre space we're in, um, what's it by Fritz Lieber, Our Lady of Darkness, where San Francisco becomes a sort of a feature, a character, a force in the story. And I don't know if it's you or someone else who, I'm probably thinking it's you because you've done some literary, nerdy traveling recently, but I know that people have mentioned about visiting the places in San Francisco where Fritz Lieber was writing that book and sort of looking out over the same views that are so much a part of that novel.
Yeah.
And it just seems so powerful to me to set a book so deeply, to set a story so deeply in a geography you know. Uh,
Yeah, yeah,
and
absolutely. And yeah, yeah. Well, we were talking about before we started recording, because I recently did the trip
hmm,
to Philip K. Dick's hometown and visited. We went to all of his childhood homes, and which there was quite a few, uh, and and seeing those things. And then I know I haven't read yet because we're doing a publication order, but eventually we're going to do Voices from the Street and the books that
right.
we wrote about Berkeley. And I just know that I probably wouldn't have been as into those books as I'm going to be if I didn't have the experience of going to the place and, you know, and seeing where the pet store where he bought horse meat for food was, which is, by the way, a dojo now. Um,
Wow.
just putting it out there. It's kind of interesting. There's a the karate dojo there now. But seeing those places, it like really it adds something to it. But when you get an author who writes so vividly about a place, you really feel transported, and that's one of the things that's really cool about it. Um, and when I talked about that balance, that's one of the things is because you know the greatest compliment, one of the greatest compliments I can give this collection come tomorrow is that I did feel transported in it. I did feel not just geographically, but also into the headspace of that I think you were going for with writing it. Is because and maybe this is because I know you and I know a lot of what your influences are, but I could really feel that. And that's one of the things about, I love, for example, I'll just take one story, for example, like when you read Stephen King's um, Jerusalem's Lot, the story, that's where you first see like, oh, this guy grew up reading Lovecraft, right?
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of this. And when you make that connection, when you later read something by Lovecraft and you go, oh, now I see where Stephen King was coming from with this. And I personally love seeing influence. I love detecting the influence on writers. Like, that's something I enjoy. So when I see a moment that I go, oh, this is very Philip K. Dick, or this is very H.P. Lovecraft in a story, I enjoy that. And there's a couple moments in this book where I felt that revelation, and I just felt that it's a very comforting feeling for me as a reader. So just wanted to put that out there as another thing. Now, at this point, I think listeners should know that I think I sold this book enough that I think you should go and pick up Come Tomorrow. I got it on the big bad Amazon, but there are multiple places where you can find it, and we're gonna get into spoiler territory as far as like we're gonna actually talk about the stories really in depth. And some of these are details that might be more fun for you to discover on your own. So if you're out there listening, I hope we've done enough to sell Come Tomorrow, and then you'll check it out. JP also has other books that I'm going to be eventually reading, the ones that, but this was the most recent, and that's one of the reasons why I picked it up, is because I wanted to get the most recent book. And I highly recommend it. So go get it. Now we're going to talk about the stories. And the book opens with the title story, which is kind of a ghost story inside of a ghost story. And you know, I'm currently writing an article about Man in the High Castle, so I'm thinking a lot about puzzles inside of puzzles, because that's one of the things that's great about Man in the High Castle, is that it's puzzles inside of puzzles. And what's neat about this title story, Come Tomorrow, is that it's a great way to start off the book, because it is a ghost inside of a ghost inside of a ghost is what I got out of this story. Can you talk about where the story came from? Is there a specific story, or you know, what's give us some more details on this one, and then I want to get into the rats, because the rats is a really cool part of it.
So the origins of the story began when I was around 16 or 17, and there was actually a plague scare in India at the time. And I was in my first year at college, and there was reports that there'd been a couple of cases of the bubonic plague in a city up north. And there was just kind of fear hanging around. You know, the internet wasn't that big, which on the one hand meant that rumors and misinformation didn't spread the way it does today. But on the other hand, it also meant that all your information was coming from the newspaper, from the radio and TV news. So you just got little bite-sized bits of information being served out to you, right? So a story would gather a lot of velocity from the fact that we didn't have much more access. And me and my friends would joke around on campus, well, see you later, don't catch plague, take care, bye, and things like that. Even though, you know, I don't think it ever became a full-scale outbreak, but, you know, there are occasional cases where the bubonic plague is still detected in countries with poor hygiene and outbreaks of rats and things like that. So this was what was going on. And around that time, in the neighborhood that my family had moved to, I started seeing these chalk messages written on doors, which in Kannada, which is the language of the state of Karnataka, which Bangalore is the capital city of. In Kannada, the signs read Nale Ba, which means come tomorrow. And because Bangalore is a very multilingual city, a lot of them also wrote in English, come tomorrow. And I started wondering what this is about. And people told me, oh, yeah. In olden times, when the plague would come, you know, there were outbreaks of plague in India in the 19th century. Plague had come to Bangalore once in the 19th century, when the British ruled the country. So the plague came to be associated with a sort of combination of plague goddesses. There's actually a tradition of plague or fever goddesses in parts of India, and it's connected with the plague and with warding it off. If you pray to her, she keeps it away from you. So these are supposedly addressed to partly invoke her, but also partly there's this legend that the ghost who carries the plague goes from house to house looking for you, to spread that infection. And she's an old woman. But if she reads a sign saying come tomorrow, for some reason she's very literal. So she'll just leave you alone that night.
It's kind of like the Chinese vampires where you throw rice in front of them. So they have to count all the grains of rice. Yeah. Oh,
And
yeah, that's cool. That's cool mythology. And well, one of the things too about the story, the most evocative, one of the things I like about this story is that it builds very well. It's a story that kind of like builds dread, and I appreciate that. As a doom metal guy, you have a lot of experience with building dread. But the scene with the rats, with the character who, and I had the quote: "The sun rose and set and rose again many times over, but the rats still covered me. A foul cloak adhered to me no matter what I did, and I did not make out the streets I was running through, which streets I was running through." This is a really cool part of the story that was very evocative, and just it gave me like shivers, because like the idea that you can't shake that feeling of just being covered in the rats. Because I got the sense more that it was a feeling, or there weren't actually rats there, but it was the feeling of it. And it's a very powerful moment. But yeah, so you chose this story to open the collection for well, it's the title story, so for obvious reasons. Were there any other reasons besides just the for choosing this as the opener? Because I think it's a great opener myself.
thanks. The book is mostly arranged chronologically in order of writing and publication. Except I don't think Axis of Discordance was the last story in it that was written, but it's the longest story, so I thought it made more sense to end with that. So I arranged it in the order it was written in, but also because I wrote them in this order, they sort of, I don't know, I feel they move better this way. I feel like Come Tomorrow is very much a young man's story. It's a high school or college guy losing his way. Dancer of the Dying is about slightly older people. So is The Song of the Eukarya. I feel like the stories also follow a kind of chronology, though I won't go out of my way to codify it or make it very precise. But even though some things happen in them which would make some of the other ones impossible, I kind of see them in this timeline, which is why I started with Come Tomorrow.
Now, the second story presents a kind of paranoia in the character who's driven by an intense form of pattern recognition, and this was the story that I felt like had well, there's a way to look at this as Lovecraftian, but I personally saw this as very Dickian, very Phil Dickian, in the sense that, and a lot of times he's underrated for his ability to write like just really terrifying moments.
Yeah.
Scanner Darkly is an example of that. Three Stigmata is an example of that. And just throughout the years, there's moments in Dick's writing where he everyone knows that he writes paranoia well, because he's a pretty paranoid guy, but the way he expresses it in there is really interesting. And this was a story that when I was writing my review, and one of the reasons why I do reviews of all the fiction that I read is a lot of times when I'm reading, I don't catch everything that when I go back and look at when I dog ear, and look, my copy is dog-eared for all these pages that I found interesting. right? And a lot of times when I go back and I try to figure out like why did I dog ear this page, right? Um, is the most I learn about a book, and a lot of times, for example, River Solomon's Unkindness of Ghosts was a book that I did not enjoy when I read it. And then when I went back to write about it, and I looked at all the pages that I dog-eared, I realized it was a good book that I didn't get on first impression, right? And this story, the second story, Dancer, I'm getting the title, Dancer of the Dying, was a story that I ended up rereading from.
Do you mean Dancer of the Dying or the
Dancer
Song
of the
of...
Dying? Yeah.
No, not Song of the Eukarya.
Well, it's the one with the pattern recognition. I thought that was the
Yeah.
second story. Yeah.
No, it's the third one, Song of the Eukarya.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm confusing them. But
no problem. That's the one on page 32.
Yes. Okay. So this is the one that I reread. Now, granted, like when I read and wrote this review, it was a couple months ago, and that's on me because I probably should have had you on right when I read it. But this story is one that I ended up, instead of just going back and looking at little parts that I found curious, I ended up rereading from beginning to end, and really got an excellent experience in rereading it, because I think the second time I really got the sense of hopelessness that the patterns caused this character, right? And one of the things that I think is cool about this story is that this character gets lost in patterns, and it's really easy when you, for example, read a story or watch a movie about a drug addict to go, oh God, that's terrible. Like I would hate to be, I'd hate to be that person. And what's really great about this story is that the first time I read it, I was like, okay, well, he sees patterns, whatever, right? And the second time I read it was when I was like, oh God, that'd be crippling and awful. Like you couldn't live with that, because just every minute you'd be like looking like, oh, look at the screen in my window and all the boxes in it, and now I'm looking at this pattern and I can't get out of it, and I can't move on. And so this story really and I know you actually refer to the character refers to his marvelous terrible brain, right? And I want to highlight this story as just really freaking effective and great horror. What's the story behind this one, and what more can you tell us about this? Because to me, this story it's my second favorite in the collection. We'll get to my favorite in a little bit, but Dan, this story really worked, and that feeling of hopelessness is what I got, especially on the second reading.
Well, I was very interested in fungus for a while. It gets really damp and humid during the monsoon seasons that we have here. It's just a season of tremendous rains, and fungus grows pretty fast if you're not careful. And I think it was in that dank atmosphere I started thinking about it. And like anyone, I've always had a little bit of pattern recognition through my life. And I think it was just one of the themes that I really wanted to put into a story. But I was also both, I've been writing stories that were so focused on the narrator being, or the main character being the person that it happens to. I wanted to have a narrator who watches it happen to someone else. So that's why I tried to create this character Swati, who talks about her boyfriend Raman, who has this progressive pattern recognition ability. And so at this point, structuring a story very much seemed to me to be like taking reality like a fish tank and dropping one little drop of something terrible into it and watching it take over everything. You've read Cat's Cradle by
Vonnegut.
Kurt Vonnegut. So that's the one with Ice Nine, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's
He's
this new
from
form
Indiana,
of.
by the way, my home state. So
There you go. So Ice Nine is this new form of ice molecule that's been developed that turns any moisture that it comes into contact with into ice instantly. And stop me if I'm remembering it wrongly,
I
because I
believe
read
so,
this.
but it's also been 20 years since I read it. So
Same here. Uh, so at this point, I was thinking of stories, of constructing a story, basically like making a little fish tank called reality and dropping a bit of Ice Nine into it. So the hopelessness is sort of a result of that. It's because I wanted to take one element, one thing, the fungi, and just blow it out of proportion. Just watch it, take over every molecule in that little fish tank.
yeah, it's a really powerful story, and it's the one that I think uh, yeah, like I said, I ended up rereading the whole thing. Um, but my favorite story in the book is uh, Shadow Me No More.
Okay.
Now, the reason why I think this was my favorite, um, well, it's a surreal horror story, and in some ways, it's the most, it's the one that I feel like could have been in Weird Tales in the 30s, right? In a lot of ways, I know that there might be moments in there that break it from that, but I just it felt very Weird Tales to me, and it's a very paranoid story about a person who is haunted by their shadow, that their shadow itself is the thing that they're scared of and tortured by. And there's a part, I can't grab my shadow's throat, can't shut up what never makes a noise. He follows me everywhere, and I can't help but read the terrible knowledge we share in his swagger. And it's funny because like one of the things I loved when I was a kid about Stephen King uh, is that a lot of times you'd say you like, oh, he wrote Miss Todd's Shortcut about a particular strip of road, or he looked at a raft in the middle of the lake and said, I can build a story out of that. And you look at all those original Last Rung in the Ladder, like he's looking at a ladder and he has this whole story come to his head, right? And what I liked about this story was I got this impression of like, oh, it's a story about his shadow. And it felt like in that tradition of looking at this one little thing and saying, I can build a horror story out of that, but it's really effective and it's really frightening because if you no horror works unless you put yourself into the character's shoes. And so if you put yourself into the character's shoes and you're really just bothered or scared of or annoyed by your shadow, like it ain't going anywhere. Anytime you turn on a light or you stand in the sun or whatever, it's going to be there. What's the story with this one? And I think you should be really proud of this story because I think it's super fucking creepy and great. And obviously it's my favorite in the collection. Like I just think it's gangbusters. I think it's great. I think it's the best one. I loved this story. Tell me about it.
Oh, thank you so much. So this story sort of emerged from the ruins of another story. I was trying to write a story about a mall in Bangalore where a fire happened, and it was quite a fancy mall, catering to quite a upmarket crowd. It had a pub and shopping, designer clothes stores and this and that. And because it was badly maintained, there was an electric short and the place went up in flames. And for years afterwards, it remained dilapidated and abandoned. So you'd go past this old abandoned TGI Fridays, and you'd look into it, and there'd still be the sign saying it's always Friday in here, but inside all you'd see would be the gutted out floor and the concrete walls and smoke stains and puddles of water that had seeped in, and just there was still this heavy, stink, uh, just the greasy feel of a place where there's been a huge fire. And I wanted to write something based on that. Uh, and that's why the story has a kind of filthy feel to it. Because I started wanting to write about a petty criminal, someone who's just violent and robs and just naturally starts killing for no particular reason than greed, uh, and who hides out here and is haunted by the shadows here. But then it all felt like there were too many things being thrown together. And it seemed to me that the idea of a killer who gets scared of his own shadow was the important thing in that story. So I threw away an entire first draft and I started again just like this with here you come like a hound, my shadow hot on my heels, here you come, like a bloodhound hot on the trail.
Right. God, it's so good. So good. And this, to me, and that idea of a killer who's scared of his own shadow, that is exactly like the kind of inspiration that I assumed was there for the story, just because, it just fits into that tradition. And I think Stephen King's the best example of that, but I think everybody in horror does that at one point or another. You can look at, Barker, Aikman, anybody like that. They're gonna have like one moment that they build off of those things. I just thought that was great. Now,
Like the telltale heart is basically someone who's so guilty about what he's done that he goes mad. Uh, the Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe.
right.
So I guess it's definitely one of those enduring things where your own mind sort of drags you down.
Now, some of these stories, like, they connect more than they're they're all individual stories, but that there are aspects of it, like, and maybe I'm reading too much into this, but it seemed like that there was a character who kind of showed up again, and there's this idea of this person that works in advertising.
Yeah, Kenneth.
Yeah, and so because that whole idea of working in advertising and advertising being part of it, I have to ask because it is something that comes up more than once in the collection. So, I mean, obviously, like with Philip K. Dick, it's the working class aspect of his characters are so important that he makes up these insane jobs like tire rig rover, stuff like that. That they're all in there, but it had to mean something that this person worked in advertising. Was there a deeper meaning that I didn't catch on to, or is it
No,
just kind of a accident? Am I reading
it's
too much?
because it's because I've worked in advertising, uh, and I was just very determined with this group of stories to write very much from things that I know firsthand. You know, so it would be honest and authentic. I was very determined uh, not to be too fanciful in the fundamentals of my stories. So I just decided to write from things I really know well. I worked in advertising, I worked in online content, I worked in the media for huge amounts of time. So I wanted to write about someone from that background and that kind of sphere of life. I think probably the story we just discussed is an exception because it's a criminal who's the narrator of Shadow Me No More. But it just came from this very simple sense that I just felt it would be much more authentic to write from life.
Right. No, in that sense, and I may be getting ahead of myself. Well, no, I'll come back to that. So I was about to go somewhere else, but I want to talk about some other things in the stories. There was one story with, and I already mentioned this, where a character talks about getting on a motorcycle and putting on protection by massive attack. Because I was listening to music as I was reading this, I said, I went and turned on that song, and it actually like. So then I was like, that was a really neat moment. When you wrote that, did you think about how that song plays into like the vibe you were creating? Because like,
Yeah,
yeah, I was like the perfect case study because I was able to
yeah.
actually put the song on. So,
Especially because these days the way we read, we can pretty much pull up anything that's being referenced.
right,
Um, like when I was reading one of Elizabeth Hand's Cass Neary novels. She talks about being in a pub, and this woman that she's hanging out with puts on "Be My Baby" by the Ronettes on the jukebox and starts singing along. And the song is so beautifully described that I immediately had to listen to it. And I thought, wow. I mean, the scene was amazing in itself in this Elizabeth Hand novel because it made me run to the song. But then knowing the song, I was like, wow, this is adding so much. I think I understand these characters so much more. And, it's optional. You don't have to run to the song, which is why I also quote some of the lyrics that to me were thematically important to why this song comes into his life at that moment. It's kind of him decompressing from this ultra masculine, ultra brutal environment that he's gotten steeped in and trying to find his way out of it with, first of all, an electronic song with, very different, a different mood. It's got Tracy Thorn's voice on it. Tracy Thorn from Everything But the Bride, and she's singing. She does a little bit of gender flipping. It starts with "Stand in front of me, take the force of the blow." She says, "You're a woman." I mean, she starts flipping the gender of the narrator of the song as the song progresses, which I thought was so interesting and tied into. I was really trying to write about, and it sounds very banal when I put it like this, but with No More Iron Cross, I was trying to write about the toxic masculinity in the heavy metal uh, subculture, having seen a little too much of it in some of the years surrounding the writing of the story. So for me, protection.
The story has No More Iron Cross, which is a story about a metal band, pretty much, right? So
there's Axis of Discordance, which is about a metal band.
Okay, that's the one. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. This is No More Iron Cross.
Okay. Well, like I said, it was a couple months ago I read it, so I remember the stories very well. Just sometimes jumbling up the titles, but
of course.
So what you're talking about? It's like I just had that experience with reading a Scanner Darkly where Phil mentions a random restaurant in Orange County in one of the parts, and I was like, I wonder if that's a real restaurant. And I Googled it, and it was this real restaurant that was like a breakfast spot in the 70s, right?
Wow.
And so that adds to the surreal nature of the Philip K. Dick future, because he's obviously writing about the present and then just add scramble suits or whatever. But it was interesting because like I could look up that restaurant and see like, oh well, he's talking about this like greasy spoon breakfast spot that and this post that I read about it was like 70-year institution in Orange County closes like in the 90s, right? But it's one that he mentions in Scanner Darkly. And I if I read that when it came out in 1977, I'm not going to look up. I'm just like, it's just a name that rolls over me, right? And it's just a thing. And it's like one of those things like with this story, it was like that song, like I had a feeling that you weren't just mentioning the song for no reason.
No.
Like I wanted to get into it. So
there is a sort of overuse sometimes of rock and roll lyrics, especially I think at some point in the 80s, every horror short story seemed to have rock and roll lyrics sort of crammed into them. I think people imitating Stephen King, who at one time used to do tons of that. But I've made a point as a music lover not to gratuitously insert songs in, but in such a way that if you were to actually go and sit with that song, it would make sense to you with the story. It's like an extra feature that if you want, you can go and listen to those songs, and it's going to give you something tied into the story. Otherwise, I wouldn't put in a piece of music at all usually.
Yeah,
so there are
a
few.
My rule of thumb with that is if I'm hearing the music in my head, or if it plays a part of the scene that's like really important, like I'll write it in sometimes, and a lot of times it doesn't make it to the second draft. But I hear what you're saying, because the thing is, well, for me too, like and I'm sure you feel this too, is when you listen to some kind of obscure music, if I write a scene about, the big takeover from Bad Brains, maybe that'll work for some people. But if I write, if the music I'm hearing in my head is Stan Kolowski, the random mod band that existed in my hometown in Bloomington, Indiana during the 80s and that no one's ever heard but me. Well, sure, maybe one of those songs occurs to me, but that's not going to do anybody else any good. And if they can find it online, maybe, I don't know. I'm not going to say I'm against it because every story has its own rules and does its own thing. And look,
that's a really interesting point. I think I wouldn't possibly refer to like in the late 90s and early 2000s. I was very steeped in the local band scene, and I remember and love certain songs that my friends' bands had composed and would play at every gig, but never recorded.
Yeah.
No one could afford to record. There were very few recording studios. Most of them didn't know how to handle metal or rock music anyway. So there are songs I know from then, which a person from Bangalore of my generation will know, but I think it would be a little too gratuitous to use them in a song, unless it's in a story, unless it's like a really long story and have the time to build in the history of what this was and what it was about, but not as a relatively concise reference in a short story.
Well, and I think that that's a product too of the pre-internet age, or before, like the ability to get anything you want whenever you want it. Because, and I've often thought about putting together a panel on this podcast where old punk rockers, hardcore kids, metalheads talk about how they discovered music before the internet. And where they found it, because the geography of it was so much more important. For example, like I grew up in Indiana, okay? And I grew up in a small college town that was sandwiched between the two big cities. The big city to the north of us was Indianapolis. The big city to the south of us was Louisville, right? And those two towns had very different scenes for punk rock and hardcore. And Indianapolis had a very different scene between the north side, which were all rich kids, and the south side, which were working class kids. And I always liked the bands from the south side better, right? Always. And then, but when I look at how before the internet, these two scenes like kind of developed their own sound, because these bands grew up more isolated. Like, yeah, they were influenced by New York bands and LA bands and all that, but Louisville had a sound, Indianapolis had a sound, Chicago had a sound, and all these cities. And I'm sure what you're talking about is, your local scene had a sound too, right?
Yeah.
And I think with the internet, it breaks down more, because if you want to be like, or if you play a style of metal that's popular in South Florida now, it doesn't matter where you are. You can be anywhere in the world, because the internet democratizes that whole thing. So that's a tangent, but I'm very interested in how the local scene relates to, especially this last story that's about a metal band, because a lot of people who don't, who have myopic American way of thinking, or European or whatever, they're not thinking about, when they think of Bangalore, the last thing they're thinking about is the metal scene, right? It's, you know what I'm talking about? Because they have their stereotypes. I know better because I've seen videos of my friends on tour playing, Indonesia, and seeing that there's a scene there. So I've had my mind open to that. So like, but a lot of times, that is something that's a new window for people, is to see, like, and it's dumb. They should realize that you guys are listening to all the same music as the rest of us. But that is a thing that may be eye-opening for people, is like, oh, what's the metal scene like in India? Because at the same time, you guys got a metal scene, but you also grew up in the culture that you did. So it's going to be different than the Florida death metal scene, for example. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So there is a question in there somewhere. But I like writing about the metal scene. What that had to be cool for you in this respect, but you also had to have something that you were trying to say. And you said you were talking about the toxic masculinity of the metal scene in the one story. So what were you wanting to express about the metal scene in Bangalore in that story? I'm sorry, I did a lot of talking there.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed that. Uh, it began very literally with going to a gig and seeing a guy that I've known off and on for years wearing an iron cross. Yeah, a piece of memorabilia that he got a hold of. And yeah, I know Lemmy wears an iron cross and all that, but
I'm not a huge Lemmy fan myself, but
yeah, it's not one of the things I actually appreciate about Lemmy, and it's a very strange symbol, isn't it? It's got the baggage that it does, and why would you want to wear it? Uh, like especially as a brown person who's not ignorant of history, why would you want to wear the Iron Cross? It's not just a cool, edgy, heavy metal insignia. It's something that became associated uh, with Third Reich, uh, you know, with things that you shouldn't possibly want to associate yourself with. And, all these, there's this whole culture where, well, I mean, we're not political. And obviously, like, we don't subscribe to that kind of ideology, but it's just about the music, man. Just about the music. And I don't mind listening to, this is not me, this is me channeling one of these guys.
yeah.
I don't mind listening to Graveyard or Screwdriver. If the riffs are good, the riffs are good. And no, I mean, you start realizing that it's not so much that they're apolitical, but they're secretly kind of turned on by fascism. You know, they're kind of turned on by that atavistic violence contained in it. I think we spoke briefly online about The Iron Dream by Norman Spinrad. And the novel by Adolf Hitler, which is The Iron Dream, kind of captures that atavistic violence. You know, the guy in the novel is carrying these phallic implements, weapons that he kills the weaklings and the under people with, and it's that same thing which I feel I see too much of in metal scenes everywhere, but also locally, where um, because the music is loud and angry and sounds violent, you think it's about anger and violence wherever it stems from. And it becomes a kind of confirmation of your own the worst parts of your own character. And it just becomes this way for men to explore their violent, non-thinking, knuckle-dragging sides together and say, hey, man, it's just about the music. And I was just so horrified by seeing this person in an iron cross. I keep returning to that, but it was a very stark moment for me. It was like, what?
Yeah.
Maybe I overreacted. I don't know, but I do believe in the power of
I don't think
symbols.
so.
And
I
to
don't think
just see that in front of me in my city on a guy that I've known on a friendly basis for over a decade. I'm like, why would you do this? And I just wanted to drill deep into that culture, but my imagination working the way it does, it didn't quite follow a literal route. I instead went through this whole metaphor of the axe lodge and the things that happen there. And in the end, of course, it spirals off into its own twist in reality for whatever reason. But yeah, it just became it was just something that really sat so badly with me. I had to spit it out into a story.
Yeah. Well, okay. So then, getting here towards the end is you write so wonderfully about Bangalore, and you do a really good job of creating the geography there. But it's not your job to write about Bangalore. You can write about any place you want. You can write about. I could see one of the good things about like controlling your art, you know, publishing your own work is that you're not beholden to anyone telling you like that you have to write about it. And a lot of, because I could tell you that if you wanted to, the publishing industry would fall over themselves to get a book like this. I believe, in the right situation. And so my question is, I mean, you write so wonderfully about Bangalore, and you make a really good argument for like how you like to write the personal and you like to write these things, but you could write about any place you want. Like, you said you didn't find your science fiction convincing. Do you have any plans to write about fictional worlds or other places, or are you gonna stick to Bangalore for the time being, or do you not know where you're going?
So, so a couple of different answers to that. Oh yeah, I think this book may have come out in the time since we last spoke. So I have a story in an anthology called the Golank's Book of South Asian Science Fiction, Volume 2.
Yeah,
Uh,
but I'm looking forward to getting that book. It's on my list.
so in a sense, I have, and I feel that some of my stories could loosely, even in this book, like a threshold hypothesis, could very loosely be Phil Dickian science fiction. Uh, Even though it's set in Bangalore, I don't think I've written some stories which are not in this collection because the theme for this collection was stories centered in Bangalore. I've written a couple of stories set in Goa, which is a place I've been spending more and more time in. I've also written a few stories that are sort of set in a kind of symbolic realm, which is not specified. In some, it's vaguely India, and some, it's not even that, it's just some place. But I'm not particularly interested personally in creating a fictional universe. Uh, I don't have any particular interest in that at all, like a far future universe or a fantasy universe. If at all I write in unspecified locations, it would be like a fractured reflection of our world. Like, have you read much Brian Evanson?
Oh yeah, tons of Brian Evanson.
A lot of his stories seem to be set in this vaguely post-apocalyptic middle America. You know,
Yeah,
there are these remnants of something that seems like a Southern Baptist or evangelical religion, but people are very broken down. But then he complicates it by having a lot of his characters have Eastern European names. So I like that kind of delocalization where the where of the story is not very clear.
yeah,
So I might explore more of that. And the other thing I find very interesting is the stories of M. John Harrison. Less his science fiction and more his, stories like The Course of the Heart and all his short stories, which are very set in Britain. And they're very British or English. I forget which is which all the time. England, Britain, Great Britain, the UK. I know you're supposed to use one and not the other, and they do get upset if you mix things up. But it's okay. We didn't declare independence to worry about these things.
right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
So
but
what I was saying about M.
yeah, go
John
ahead.
Harrison was there's a lot of Englishness running through these stories of his, but they also feel geographically dispersed. So I'm very interested in trying to explore more of that. But I think I would always tend to return to something Indian at the core of my settings, just because, again, it just feels more honest. Like Stephen King is always ultimately going to return to Maine, you know?
Yeah, yeah, and a lot of times when he writes about other places, it's not as good.
Absolutely.
I know he's living in Florida a lot, so he's been able to get a little bit more Floridian. But I think he's a person that needs that geography in his writing. But hey, um, well, and I think that it's a good place for. I do think it's good for I have gone out of my way to try and read more international authors in the last couple of years, especially trying to study and learn about Chinese science fiction,
Hmm.
because I think that they're doing a lot of really interesting things. I'm currently reading Celestial Empire, which is a history of Chinese science fiction, and I think that especially since they're going to be hosting Worldcon here coming up soon, um, the world is going to have to start paying more attention. I know Barack Obama giving the three body problem really helped Chinese science fiction, like when he blurbed it. But but there's also deeper Chinese science fiction to
There is.
that. And for example, an author who I would compare you to that would be Han Sung, who is a great Chinese weird fiction writer. And Dark Moon Press has a primer to Han Sung that I recommend. And he's kind of like the Brian Evanson of China.
Wow.
But your work gets compared a lot to obviously Eichmann, Lovecraft, and Clark Ashton Smith. But I do think that there are some modern writers that, if people don't read the classics, I would say your work reminds me of Laird Barron or Brian Evanson, kind of the early short stories of Poppy Bright, that kind of thing. But when I say that with Poppy Bright, is mostly because I think she wrote so deliciously about New Orleans in a way that I think you write great about Bangalore. So putting that out there to people. But before we close up shop on this interview, I think one of the things that makes you such a great writer is that you are so well read, because most of the great authors that when you get there, like Laird is an example. If you start talking to Laird about what he's read, his favorite horror short stories or whatever, he will go on and on and on and on, because and I think that's what makes him a great writer, is because he loves devouring stories. He loves breaking them apart. And like, if you talk to him about, for example, why Jack Vance is a great writer, and then you'll see why Laird is a great writer just by how he dissects what this other great writer did, right? And I think dissecting this is one of the things that makes us able to, when we sit down to write a story, to unconsciously create these like really great works of fiction. And so when I say that I enjoyed seeing your influences in there, that's kind of what I meant, is that I can see, what you get out there. So on that note, as a fun thing to end with, three to five classic authors who you feel most influenced this collection, and 3 to 5 of the modern authors who you think really influenced this collection, and then we'll wrap things up after that. You don't have to give an exact number, but just a few authors, classic and modern.
3 classic authors would be M.R. James, the ghost story writer as far as I'm concerned. And I keep rereading his stories and just being startled. He builds things up so meticulously, and he comes from his own niche interests. All his characters are academics who are interested in old manuscripts and inscriptions, and it's not particularly exciting on the face of it. Everything is set in a library or a historical society, or at most a professor might go on vacation to the seaside. But the way he builds from the world he knows, which is the world of academicians, and the things he knows, which come from the world of very abstruse scholarship, and then builds these ghost stories that have become classics of the genre and that are still told year after year to people. I just love that. I'm totally in awe of the way he constructs the story. And again, like I said, we take his stories for granted now because the BBC does an M.R. James adaptation every year, and it's like a Christmas tradition in the UK to read out ghost stories, including those by M.R. James. But they're actually so strange. Here's this guy who spent most of his life working in a college or a school and doing research into very, very, very dry, not dry, but very abstruse topics. And he wrote stories that came out of that world and is about people who live in that world. And yet people like us today who have nothing of the same kind of life as him are still reading and being fascinated by his stories. So that gives me this deep sense that you need to write from what pulls you the most deeply. Don't try and look at, okay, what are the top 20 books in the genre? Let me take elements from here, from there, and the other. Uh,
What
so
moves you? Yeah.
yeah, Emma James really gave me the sense that it's okay to get into my own esoteric interests and write about them. Other classic authors, I'll try to keep this shorter. I can obviously go on and on about things like this. Classic authors,
And it's late for you.
it's it's okay. I mean,
It's morning
it's
for
so
me.
late. Yeah, it's so late that it no longer matters. It's past midnight, so I'll just stay up late and listen to some music and read a bit after this.
So two more classic authors than the modern.
Two more classic authors. So the second choice is not very different from the first one. Sheridan Le Fanu, who perhaps wrote 60 to 80 years before M.R. James and was an Irish writer of ghost stories, whose stories also particularly an account of some strange occurrences in Ongier Street fascinated me because A, it's set in an actual street in Dublin that you can still look at on Google Map View, and B, because as I started reading it, the atmosphere just became so concrete. It's set in an old, rambling, dilapidated house that these two medical students have rented to live in because it's cheap, right? And to cram for their exams. And I don't know, that just hit me. I've during my college days and my early working days rented out some pretty broken down old places to stay in, and I suddenly realized that even though this is set in the early 19th century and these are Irish people, oh, I know what's going on in this story. I know the kind of life these boys are living. And again, it became because he wrote from the scenes he knows. But wow, just a sense that the next house on the street, which is a little older than the other ones and is probably going to be demolished in a few years, could actually harbor some terrible secret within it. A third classic writer, Aikman. I would have to say Robert Aikman was on my mind a lot of times, uh, especially during the years when I was writing these stories, because I was so fascinated by the way every story is not just single-minded. There are two or three strange images and diversions that he just throws in because his imagination is bubbling over. We don't think of him as an extravagant writer because his prose is so measured and controlled, but actually he just throws in so much psychotic shit into every story.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. And the modern ones. A few
yeah,
modern names.
modern names. So I really started thinking that modern weird fiction might be a thing that's interesting and has room for everyone. And I like, as much as I like classic fiction, because particularly of two writers who are no longer with us, sadly, W.H. Pugmire and Joseph Pulver. And Pugmire, you may not stylistically see him in the way I've written these stories, but one thing that always appealed to me is the immense melancholy of his narrators. They are beautifully sad people, you know, and particularly in the story that I think you mentioned, the Song of the Eukarya, about the pattern recognition. I was really driven by wanting to capture that just that beautiful twilight sadness that seems to run through so much of Pugmire. And I think that surfaces here and there in other stories also. And with Pulver, it was just, he just explode on the page. And that sense of freedom that you could try that. You could write like an incantation. I think the story that you particularly enjoyed, Shadow Me No More, is also written in this very rapid fire. I think it would be a great story to read aloud. And if you've read Joseph Pulver, you know what I mean, right? Uh, he's very
I one
dynamic.
time I was supposed to be in a reading block with Pulver at a convention. It was Cody Goodfellow and I and Pulver, and he he read through the whole block. Cody and I didn't get to read because he had no idea how much time he was taking, and we were only supposed to be reading like short bits. So Cody and I both had two like flash pieces, and I don't think either one of us cared. Like we just sat there and we're like, okay, there goes Joe. Um, and that was great. But
Yeah.
I'm really glad that I got to meet both him and Puckmeyer, specifically at those Lovecraft film fests. You know, they were big hits there. So, yeah. And a third one, because you did two. Anybody else modern?
So a lot of these stories were written before I sort of immersed myself in a lot more contemporary uh, writing, but I would definitely put M. John Harrison as a abiding influence on how I
I have
see
to
the
admit, I
world.
haven't read a lot of M. John Harrison. I'm gonna have to, as Brian Keene would say, I'd have to unfuck that.
Yeah,
Um,
unfortunately.
you know, uh,
Yeah.
I have had books on my list, but I just haven't gotten there yet. So
His novel, which was released a year ago, "The Sunken Land Now Begins to Rise Again," is a great place to start. It's just very uncanny. It's about these strange conspiracy theory circles in this very gloomy Brexit Britain. And it's very hard to quite define it, but it's this slow unraveling unease. I think I would really compare him, say, amongst American writers whom you may have read most, maybe to someone like Michael Sisko. Although Sisko again is very different from him, but it is a very strange sense that there's an engine that's working in these novels that is the engine of the world, but it's a world that's been put together very differently than you ever realized. I get that from Cisco also, and sometimes from Evanson. Evanson is great about that. You really see this off-kilter world engine being revealed to you. I don't know if it makes sense to you. You've read both
no, it
Evanson and
does.
Cisco.
It does. And Evanson is probably my favorite modern short story author.
Yeah.
So
There's
um,
just a sense that he's seen the engine. He's peeped under the bonnet, and it's not the nice logical combustion engine that we thought it was. You
yeah,
know.
if you get a chance, once you if you haven't read his latest collection, but I really highly recommend, not just because I did it, but the interview that I did with Brian about that one. It's funny because he joked with me that I gave away all of his secrets that
Yeah,
interview,
me
but
too.
I'm
Definitely.
very, very proud of that interview. But as far as he's just to me, you know, for when I was growing up, nobody could hold a candle to those
Yeah,
first books of blood for Clive Barker. They just,
sure.
for me, he was it, and I haven't felt the power of a. And I assumed that reading those short stories were part of like finding them at a young age and discovering them. And Brian Evanson is the first time since
Mm,
then that short stories, all by one author, have
mm,
hit me
yeah.
as hard as Clive did when I was very young reader, right?
Mm,
And so I'm so impressed with Evanson. But anyways, on to your work. Yeah, I could. These are all like really, I just love to hear because some of these I've read a little bit of M.R. James, but I've read Pegmeyer and but I haven't read Harrison, so that's interesting, and I'll definitely have to check him out. But we've already kind of given the speech to the people who might not have heard it, so we're assuming the people that have made it this far hopefully took my advice and got the book. And if they haven't, it's still. I don't think we've said anything that will ruin your experience of discovering these stories. These aren't like aha moments or spoilers. They're just kind of vibes and themes. And I think and that's one of the things that I think you're so good at, JP, is vibe and tone, and it's great. And it's one of the coolest books I read last year, and
Thank you.
it's so funny because I have a hard time when I rank books at the end of the year. It's hard for me to rank collections. I just think it's weird because I just think in terms of novels. But this was definitely one of the coolest books that I read last year, and very excited. I mean, I could talk to you all day because we have a lot with the shared interests, animals, veganism, metal,
Yeah.
Philip K. Dick, and just a weird fiction. So like, it's a fucking honor to have you on the show and to talk about this. And I know we could do probably another 3 more hours, but I want to keep it digestible for people. So if people want to find you and get into your work, and what should I read next? Because this was the first book that I bought. Because I was gonna get the Strength of Water, the novella next. Was my
Strength of Water is definitely the next place to go. It's a short novella, which is set in India in the year 1999 in a slightly different historical timeline than ours, in which the advent of Hindu fascism in the country happened a lot sooner and in a lot more extreme a way. So in one sense, it's kind of my Man in the High Castle. Uh, but it was very experimental the way I wrote it. And I hope people enjoy it. The language could seem a little overwhelming, but just go with it. It all holds together, I hope, somehow in the end. I am working on having another collection of short stories like Come Tomorrow, which will cover my less Bangalore-centric short fiction, because there's been a lot published since this was assembled.
Right.
And maybe that'll come out next year or towards the end of this year. I'm largely self-publishing these days, apart from anthologies and magazines, because it just gives me a little control over putting things out. And for example, Come Tomorrow is something I put together because people were asking me, where can we find all these stories in one single, easily ordered book? And it seems to have really done well for itself. At least I made back the amount of money I put into publishing it, which is not bad.
all you could ask for,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
A lot of times.
So if people could read Strength of Water, that would be great. I hope they enjoy it. If they want to follow me into a completely different kind of writing, Clash Books has a collection of my poetry called Broken Cup. And maybe you'll find that interesting. But it's not horror at all. I don't write genre poetry. But it might be interesting.
right.
Yeah, that's about it.
Well, yeah. Now you got me intrigued because the Man in the High Castle reference, because obviously I'm thinking about it a lot, but also
In the sense of an alternate timeline and the expedited advent of fascism in my country. I was writing it looking at the events of 2019 and 2018, but thinking, what if this had already happened in 1999?
well, it's funny because a lot of times, yeah, when I think Osama by Lavi Tidar is very Man in the High Castle, but a lot of times people don't understand how it's Man in the High Castle, right? You know, they're just like, where are the Nazis? You know, and you know, I've got a lot out of my way to make the point that Man in the High Castle is a lot more than just Nazis.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's about questioning history itself, and that's where like Lavi Tidar was on a similar and there, and yeah, so I'm interested in what you got going on there, and people can find your music online. We already talked about that. Jin and Miskatonic, that's with the D, Jin, and find that too. And I think certainly I will have you back for panels, things, and when the next book comes out, I'm sure I'd love to have you back. And it was awesome talking to you today. Thank you everybody who listened. If you made it this far, join me with eventually I'm going to read Strength of Water and have JP back. So we want to definitely support the authors who are doing amazing shit out there, and JP is one of them. So thank you, JP, for coming on. Any last words?
No, that's it. Thank you so much. This was great fun. And yeah, I'm looking forward to a couple of the projects that you're working on, which you told me about earlier, especially the fact that you're finally writing a PKD book. That's long overdue. Good luck. I mean, you've got some big plans. You've got got a lot of work to do in the year ahead. So
I do, and I will, when this is done recording, talk to you about one of them, but well, after the recording's off. But thank you for joining me, and hopefully we'll talk soon.
all right.